So what I'm attempting to do tonight is really kind of audacious, to try to resume 13 different presentations into an hour, and then to devote a half an hour to see if I can establish any connections between them or see any patterns in it. But God loves a trier, so I'm going to give it my best shot. So you have the outline there, what I'm attempting to do. And I want to start off with the quotation that kicked the entire exploration into action way back in October of 2011. This statement from the Gospel of Thomas, which you find in a very diluted form in the other synoptic Gospels. You normally find it as, ask and you shall receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. But Thomas, which is an older Gospel than the other synoptics, in fact, has a much more extended version of that. And according to Thomas, Jesus says, when you seek, you must not stop seeking until you find. And when you find, you will be disturbed. And after you've been disturbed, you will marvel. And when you marvel, you will reign. And when you have reigned, you will rest. So in Thomas's version, there are 6 stages of the process. There's seeking, there's finding, there's being disturbed, there's marveling, there's ruling, and then there's resting. And so the exploration in some senses for us represented the searching and the finding and the being disturbed. But I'm hoping obviously that it doesn't end, that the process doesn't end there, that we're going on and that we've begun as well to try to marvel, to see the meta-cosmologies behind all of this, so that we rule, not in the sense that we're dominating over anybody, but that we're self-empowered as individuals, as cultures, and as nations, that we're self-empowered and that nobody is enslaving us, and that's the final kind of resting. The final resting is the resting of self-empowerment where everybody else is accorded the same kinds of privileges. So that was our vision as we started this process a little over about a year and a half ago. So in section A, I get 3 subpoints here. I just want to mention what the scientific method is, which is what we attempted to employ in the course of the study of each topic. And basically, a scientist will make a whole bunch of observations, look at a whole bunch of data, try to identify if there are any patterns, any possible patterns in her data. And then if she thinks that she sees some kind of a pattern, she will create some kind of a hypothesis that will explain what the pattern might be. And then set up an experiment to test the hypothesis. And if it proves to be correct, then the experiment has to be replicated in somebody else's laboratory to make sure it wasn't just a statistical fluke. And if several scientists replicate it and get the same results, then you've established a scientific principle. And then by putting together a bunch of scientific principles, you create a scientific model. But inevitably, in any real science, at some stage, no matter how good the model appears to be, anomalous data will be generated by further observations. And then the old model has to be tweaked in order to try to accommodate the new data. And that sometimes the old model can do that. We saw, Copernicus and his notion of revolution around the sun and trying to create more models to account for perturbations in the cycles. And finally, the whole model is groaning at the seams. And at some stage, the model is totally unsatisfactory. There is so much new anomalous data coming in that the old model is no longer sufficient. And then you have to dismantle it and erect a new model that can accommodate all the old data and the new data. And this happened to us twice in the 20th century with relativity theory and with quantum mechanics, that the old Newtonian model was totally insufficient when you got down to the microcosmic level. And so new models had to be created. Now, in the middle of all this, it's important for us to realize that science can never arrive at absolute truth. What science can do is create the best possible models to explain the observable data, but it is never truth. It's always an interpretation which is subject to further observation and subject refinement. So we have to keep searching and keep looking, even when we're using the scientific method. Now, the second section I call then the Thinkometer Test. So here's the word I just coined, a thinkometer. Imagine you've got a thinkometer and there's 5 points on the thinkometer. The first one is naivete. The second one is gullibility. The third one is critical thinking. The fourth one is skepticism. And the fifth one is debunking. Now, the naive person is the one who has no viewpoints on anything, and you can persuade them to any viewpoint you want just by presenting your theory. And they'll just go along with it because they have no viewpoints themselves. The gullible person is a little bit further on. They have viewpoints, but they can be very easily dissuaded or persuaded to abandon their viewpoints and to accept your one. Further along is the critical thinker. And this is the person who's using not just their intellect, but intuition and all of their other abilities to look at the data and make assessments as to whether or not they can subscribe to a particular theory. The fourth position is the skeptic. And the skeptic is fairly closed. The skeptic is invested in a particular viewpoint. The skeptic typically makes an act of faith in a particular model and will try hell and high water to disprove anything that contradicts it or has another alternative. But if you present them with enough data, you can persuade the skeptics typically. At the end of that, you got the debunker. And the debunker is a fundamentalist of the worst stripe. They are totally closed to any position they haven't previously held. And so where the job of the critical thinker is to investigate the unexplained, the job of the debunker is to explain the uninvestigated. And that's what happens. Without ever investigating stuff, they explain away how it couldn't be or how it isn't. And so our position is this third position, to try to look at the data with open minds, to use our intellect, our intuition, and all our other faculties, and make up our own minds for ourselves what makes sense to us. And the third point in the introduction, the purpose of this exploration series then has been this. Every single one of us has a personal cosmology. There's a model within each one of us that tells us how to respond in any situation. So no matter what situation you find yourself in, you'll make some kind of response to it, whether it's a verbal response or a behavioral response. So what is driving that response? What is driving is you have some kind of an unconscious model. Unfortunately, it has been unconsciously acquired and is unconsciously accessed. But you're going to make some response in a situation, and that response is obviously being driven by some kind of a paradigm or a model that's interior to you. Now, the problem is it's unconsciously acquired from the mass media or the school system or the churches or the politicians, and it's unconsciously accessed. Most of us couldn't tell you, why did you say that rather than this? Or why did you do that rather than this? Most of us don't know, just seemed like the correct response to make, but we couldn't explain it to you. So the job of the exploration series was to try to bring this to consciousness, to try to bring to consciousness the models with which we respond to life. Now, there's a bumper sticker that I'm going to kind of tone down a little bit that more or less says, if you're not enraged, you're asleep. And it's true. If you're not enraged, you're asleep. But if you stay enraged and don't go beyond enraged, you never get enlightened. So there's things you have to do with your rage, things that work and things that don't work. And that's what I was hoping we would figure out as well. What can we do? If we're not enraged, we're asleep. But if we're only enraged, we're not enlightened. So where do we go with our rage? How do we channel it positively? And my hope was that at the end of this 13-month period of examination or exploration, that every single one of us will be able to create our own personal cosmology and say, here's what I believe about this, here's what I hold about that. So that having studied all of these topics, we have informed viewpoints on all of them, and we have seen some kind of connections, or there's some kind of theory that can hold and bind all of these pieces together, because they're not disparate pieces, they're pieces of the same single jigsaw puzzle. So that's kind of the introduction material. Now, for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to attempt to do a review of the 13 topics that we've covered so far. The first topic we covered was the year 2012. And I gave that talk, I suggested that there are three possible ways of looking at December 21st, 2012. One was as a date, another was as an era, and the third way was as an invitation. So the date was people who believed that on that specific date, something radically was going to change on planet Earth. And I haven't subscribed to that ever. Rather, it felt to me like it was going to be a very, very symbolic date. And I gave the example many times of Rosa Parks in the early 1960s, that this young, black, African-American woman who refused to go down to the back of the bus. When she did that, she had no idea, that at some stage she'd be regarded as the symbol for what happened in the 1960s. And at that period, in that era, you had civil rights, you had women's rights, you had animals' rights, you had the peace movement, you had altered states of consciousness through hallucinogens, you had Eastern mysticism, you had the ecology movement, and you had us plopping a man on the moon. So in that period, that 1960s, was an extraordinary period. And in some senses, Rosa Parks symbolized that But the day she refused to go down to the back of the bus, she had no idea that she would be a symbol for that entire movement. And so for me, it's felt always like that the date 2012, December 21st, was always going to be such a symbolic date, that it wasn't that something extraordinary would happen on that date, but that it would be the kind of constellation point or the symbol for something different. Because primarily, it was an invitation. It was almost like a Rorschach test. People began to project their fears and their dreams, their nightmares and their visions onto this date. Some people believing that the world was going to end in all manners of ways, and others believing that there was going to be some kind of an extraordinary breakthrough. So I've never believed that it represented post-history, but with Sri Aurobindo, that it represented post-human in the sense of ordinary human beings being invited to transcend into what he called the superhuman, that it represent that movement. To kind of paraphrase Marshall McLuhan, where he said, the medium is the message, I would say that the focus was the transformation. It was the focus on this date, and the focus began to happen maybe 20 years before that date. But it was the focus on that date that is creating the transformation. It is giving us the vision. Some people are getting nightmares about it, and other people are getting visions about it. So 2012, for me, represented this extraordinary invitation to think life differently. December 21st, 2012, for me, represented the focus that would create the transformation. So it was never about the end of the world coming, or that one date something catastrophic was going to occur. So that's a little synopsis of the first session. The second topic we covered was Forbidden Archeology. And in this topic, I was looking at whether or not, the model of our history that we were educated with, in high school and in college, whether in fact it's accurate. And to be very, very simplistic about it, according to that, the timeline, the Darwinian timeline, to shrink it right down, the belief was that the first hominids appeared about 6 million years ago, and that Homo sapiens appeared only 100,000 years ago. Now, I'm suggesting that other archaeological findings give the lie to this. So, for instance, there's fossilized evidence showing that these may not be accurate at all, that the hominids may be cyclical, or Homo sapiens sapiens may be in a cycle that's occurred many times. So in Indonesia, in the 1990s, human remains were discovered in strata which were 800,000 years old. In Italy, a few years later, human skeletons were found in rock strata going back to 4 million years of age. And in Illinois, in 1892, a human skeleton was found in stratification at 300 million years ago. How do you explain that kind of fossilized evidence? So if we really believe that we date, our rocks and the foliage and the kind of the fossils according to the rock strata they're found in, and these are just 3 out of about 35 different ones, including ones here in California, that give the lie to the model that we've operated on. The buildings give the lie very, very often. Sophisticated buildings that go much further than alleged civilization. According to the best estimates, civilization begins with the Sumerians in 2800 BC, 3800 BC, so less than 6,000 years ago. The first civilizations occur in Mesopotamia. But we know, in fact, from evidence on the weathering in the Sphinx, that the only way the weathering in the Sphinx could have happened was rain weathering, and the best estimates are that that particular artifact was created 12,000 years ago, and that the pyramids of Egypt do not just go back 2,500 years BC, they go back at least 10,000 years BC. They're probably 12,000 years of age. Just a few years ago, in a village in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, extraordinary complex structures were unearthed, which had been built and then covered intentionally with sand 12,000 years ago, at a time when allegedly we were hunter-gatherers and nomads. Where in God's name did these sophisticated buildings come from? In Baalbek in Lebanon, stones were quarried and lifted 26 feet into the air to form a platform, which the Romans subsequently built the Temple of Jupiter on. But these stones, some of them are 800 tons weight, carved stones that have been lifted up 26 feet, and set in position. Now, the Sumerians claimed that that was actually a spaceport for the Anunnaki, but there is no modern equipment that could lift 800 tons and set it in position like that. You run about 100 different cranes juggling with each other to get, the possibility of doing that. And while I'm talking, Karen, could you get me a drink of water, Pat? There is evidence from map making. So, for instance, the Ptolemaic map, which was discovered in 1422, shows an island off the west coast of Ireland called High Brazil, and it's part of Irish mythology. I heard about this when I was a little kid from my grandfather. It's called High Brazil. Sometimes it's called Tír na nÓg. But the thing is, the Google Maps now show it, the contours and the size and the location of it. But the Ptolemaic map from 1424 records this, and it is absolutely accurate as to the positioning of it and the contours of it. Now, the problem is that this island was covered up 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. So who made this map? Where did it come from? There's a map called the Piri Reis map, dating to 1513, by a Turkish admiral, which shows the coastline of South America and of Africa, and both the longitude and the latitude are correct in it. We only discovered longitude in the year 1790. But this map shows it really, really accurately. And according to Piri Reis, he's going back into older maps that he claims go all the way back to Alexander the Great. So how Alexander the Great flourished about 330 BC. How in God's name did Alexander the Great have maps of the south coast of America? We have DNA evidence, that contradicts a lot of what, our archaeology is telling us. So, for instance, humans have 46 chromosomes. We get 23 chromosomes from each of our parents. We are the only primate with 46 chromosomes. All of the other primates have 48 chromosomes. So how in God's name do you descend from a primate by reducing the number of chromosomes? In the other primates, what constitute number 2 and 3 have been fused in the human genome as a single chromosome. So how do you reduce the number of chromosomes and create a more complex individual? The Genome Project, when it was set up, expected that it would find somewhere in the region of 100,000 to 140,000 genes. They wound up finding merely 23,000. Mitochondria, or mitochondrial DNA, which comes through the lineage only of the mother, goes back to 7 individuals. When you do the lineage of it, all human beings on planet Earth go back to 7 women. They're called often mitochondrial Eve. So a lot of this is giving the lie to the archaeological model and the timing that we've been brought up with. That was the second talk. The third talk was on finances, and Bill Fried gave this talk. He pointed out, and anybody who's done their research knows, that what we think of a federal institution, which is called the Federal Reserve, which was created illegally in the year 1913. It's a private group. It has nothing got to do with the federal government. It's a private institution that mints money, loans it to the American government, and then we pay taxes to pay off the interest on that. And most of our income tax goes to paying off the interest in this money, which is minted by the Federal Reserve and loaned to the American government. And so there are a few other places in the world, governments who are not minting their own money, but we are one of them. And the process through which this came into place in 1913 was a very illegal process. We create all these extraordinary mythology, like the myth of the fiscal cliff. There is no such thing as a fiscal cliff. It's a red herring. It reminds me of my time in Kenya when Idi Amin was killing 300,000 of his own people, and at the same time he was pointing fingers at South Africa and talking about apartheid in South Africa. Now, apartheid was happening in South Africa, but there was nowhere like those number of peoples being killed or tortured. When I lived in Kenya, we got our electricity in Kenya from Jinja, which was a big dam in Uganda on the northern shore of Lake Kisumu, or what used to be called Lake Victoria. At one stage, the electricity supply for all of Kenya failed, and they found out that the dam in Jinja had been clogged up with dead bodies. It was a favorite place for the soldiers to dump bodies. The whole works had been jammed up, and there was no electricity in Kenya, Tanzania, or Uganda for a period of a few weeks while they cleared out the debris. So he's pointing, to take the focus away from himself onto South Africa. The fiscal cliff is just another way of organizing the same kind of thing. Make up a totally fictitious problem and then put all our energy into solving it. Somebody sent me a cartoon a few days ago. Imagine that you get home and you find out that your toilet has backed up and literally your entire lower floor is covered in debris. And you find out that the sewerage system for the entire town is backing up through your toilet, and now it's rising to the second floor. It's now halfway up the second floor. So what do? You call in a building contractor, and you take off the roof, and you build a third story to accommodate the rising crap, literally. That's what the fiscal cliff is. It literally is an effort to create a third story on our finances so that we can accumulate more and more crap that we're spending on the military-industrial complex. It is totally fictitious. It does not exist. We have a situation where the banksters, literally almost crashed this entire country in 2008, and not a single one of them has gone to jail. But you failed to pay your mortgage, and you'll be out in your ear within a few months. Now, I want to introduce a little bit of part levity and part reality here. I came across a little video. It's only 2 minutes and I think 46 seconds. It's a black rapper who's talking, and his language is pretty choice. I have to warn you about that. But it's an extraordinary indictment of the government on our finances. So I want you to watch this it's just less than 3 minutes.
United States government, $14.6 trillion, B. All my credit cards would have been cut off a long time before that. All I'm asking y'all to do is balance a fucking budget, B. That's all y'all gotta do. Son, we voted for y'all because we were worried about gay rights, marijuana getting legalized, all of these other things that we were concerned about. How can we get roads, more money for schools? You bastards can't even balance a checkbook? A checkbook, B? This is something every American has to go through every week. We gotta figure out what we're gonna pay, what we gotta put off a little bit. You bastards got the $14.6 trillion before you realize, oh shit, we've reached the debt ceiling. Listen, you're the best and the brightest. Harvard, Yale, Brown, Cornell, this is what we put out. Should have went to Norfolk State. Bastards, you would have got the same education. You would have spent a whole lot less money. Simple fucks. All I'm saying to you is, and this isn't personal, this isn't Democratic or Republican, this is everybody. Stop being a dickhead and balance the fucking budget. My second question though, my second issue is, how the fuck do you owe China, B? How do you owe China? How can I tell my daughter with a straight face that capitalism is a better system than communism if we're borrowing all of our fucking money from the biggest communist country on the fucking planet? You ass, stop your life, B. Get your whole shit together. Get all of your shit together. Don't do another press conference. Fuck CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Don't do any more television appearances until you got my fucking budget balanced. And I'm gonna tell you this, everybody who has a loan to the federal government, fuck paying it. Don't pay your budget. Don't pay your bills, because they ain't paying theirs. The fuck I gotta pay my bills for if you don't pay your bills? I'm not doing what you don't do. You're the leader. I'm following. You don't pay, I don't pay. How about that, simple motherfuckers? What is your credit score? What's the government's credit score right now? It's gotta be a 350. But you motherfuckers gonna tell me I can't buy a car if my credit score is at a certain number? Your whole life is a 350, B. Your FICO score, your Experian, fucking TransUnion, all your shit's low, B. Get your shit together. President Obama, personal to you. All the black people was proud. We got a black president. You acting like one right now, B. Pay your fucking bills on time. Stop. I ain't even got, it's too fucking hot for me to talk. I'm sweating and shit. Shit got me sweating. You know why? Because y'all ain't paid a fucking light bill on Earth. That's why it's 37 fucking states right now going through a heat wave. Because not only did y'all not pay the fucking Chinese, y'all didn't pay the fucking light bill. You see how fucking hot it is? I'm pissed the fuck. I can't. Ah!
I'm trying to figure out if we can get him to do the next lecture. Okay. He did almost as well as you did, Bill. Okay. The next topic, the fourth topic we covered, were crop circles. And this was to introduce some kind of optimism into the situation, that we're not on our own. So what we found out was that these crop circles have now appeared in over 54 countries. Since 1980, there have been over 6,000 of them appeared. They started off as circles in the 1970s, and then they become more complex, quintuplets. And you got some extraordinary sacred geometry where you had the notion of what's called squaring the circle, which is really, really difficult because you're dealing with an irrational number like pi. So there are geometrical ways where you can approximate squaring the circle. And you got some of these quintuplets doing precisely that. In the 1990s, you had the first linear, no longer a circle obviously, a linear configuration which is over 300 feet long. And then on July the 7th, 1996, you had this huge Julia set. Julia set is a very, very elegant mathematical formulation, where you make out a formula where you can create kind of fractal images. And this huge Julia set appeared in a field just next to Stonehenge. Now, the interesting thing is, it appeared in broad daylight. A pilot flying over in a small plane at 5:50 p.m., flying over Stonehenge and over this particular field, there was nothing in the field. He came back 45 minutes later, and there's a 915 foot by 508 foot Julia set imprinted in the core on the field next to Stonehenge. In 1974, the SETI organization, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and Carl Sagan sent a message into outer space so that if there were civilizations out there, that they could interpret who we were and where we were located. And the message, very simply, it was done in binary code, but it said that gave the following information. We operate using a decimal system. Our dominant elements here are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, but we're basically a carbon-based life form. We have double-stranded DNA. Our average height is 5 feet 9 inches. Our population is 6 billion, and we inhabit the third planet from our sun in our solar system. And then there was a sketch of a radio telescope, and that was sent out from Arecibo in South America in 1974. On the 14th of August in the year 2001, there was this huge, big crop circle formation in the field next to the biggest radio telescope in the United Kingdom. And it was done in binary code as well. And it was a point-for-point response to what had been sent out in Arecibo in 1974. It said, we also employ a decimal system. Our dominant elements were a silicon-based life form. Our DNA code is triple-stranded. Our average height is 3 feet 4 inches, but we've got much larger heads than you guys. Our population is 21 billion. We inhabit the third, fourth, and fifth planets from our sun. And then where the telescope was in our version, there is some kind of a drawing which we still haven't been able to interpret. So the news isn't all bad. Obviously, we're not the only intelligent, if intelligent we can be, system, civilization out there. The fifth lecture was Agriculture, Ecology, and Geo-engineering, and Bill Freed did this one again. I'm very grateful to Bill for doing that. In 1920, the president of International Harvester, this big group who make tractors and huge big industry, agricultural machinery, had a meeting with the president of the United States, in which he convinced him that in order to feed the world's population, agriculture needed to be taken away from little farmers who really had no idea what they were doing. And they set about a plan for doing this. And the plan was very simple. During bad harvests, very, very typically, small farmers go into debt. And they take out loans from banks. And then in the good years, when the harvests are good, they pay back these. So the plan was that whenever the farmers would default, they would be forced to sell their land and their farms to these big conglomerates. And over a period of 30 or 40 years, these big groups now owned a whole bunch of America, and then they proceeded to turn it into a dust bowl. Instead of feeding the world's population, they simply impoverished it and destroyed the land. You have a situation where even in California last year, we failed to get GMO labeling on our foods. We don't have the right to know if there's genetically modified material in our foodstuff due to a huge big campaign launched against it by the big seed companies. We know, for instance, that what's called the revolving door in Washington, that a very typical situation, somebody from Monsanto, a high executive in Monsanto, will resign his position in the industry, will be appointed to the Ministry for Agriculture in the United States of America, push through legislation that really benefits the Monsantos of the world, and then when it's pushed through, resign and go back up and take up his position again in Monsanto. And it's known in Washington, D.C. as the revolving door. And it's obviously not just happening in agriculture, it's happening in other areas where corporations have interests in particular kinds of legislation, And CEOs and top flight leaders resign from their positions in industry, are given positions in government ministries, create legislation that favours their own group, and then resign and go back and take up their positions again. We know that groups like Monsanto, for instance, have taken out patents on seeds that have taken almost 10,000 years of human horticultural ingenuity to create. And now they're creating patents on this, and others can't use it without their permission. It is illegal in India right now for farmers to take seeds from last year's crop and attempt to sow it for next year's crop. There's an agreement between Monsanto and the Indian government that anybody who attempts to do this will be jailed. So farmers can't even use their own seeds. They have to buy seeds from Monsanto. It is illegal in Guatemala. There was an agreement made between the Bechtel Corporation, which is based in Southern California, and the Guatemalan government that it is illegal for the residents of Guatemala City in the slums to trap water, rainwater from their own roofs and use it for drinking purposes. Instead of that, they have to buy water which is given them in Guatemala by the Bechtel Corporation from their reservoir. They have to buy it. In fact, there were huge demonstrations and riots, and this piece of legislation was finally overthrown. But can you imagine that it was illegal for a poverty-stricken person literally to take water from his own roof and feed it to his child? And now we have the phenomenon of the chemtrails, and I personally know somebody who was a parishioner of mine 20 years ago who was involved in this exercise and has spoken to me about it, where Bill Gates and a few other well-meaning, I presume, individuals are now seeding our skies, trying to put up little particles that will reflect the sunlight back into space to prevent global warming. But it's aluminium particles falling to the earth and literally destroying health and our crops. And obviously we have no say, we don't get to say why this is happening or who's in charge of it. And I personally know somebody who's funding that operation and who thinks he's doing well. 60 years, almost 100 years in fact, after the president of the International Harvester prevailed upon the President of the United States to let the people who knew agriculture take over from the farmers so we could feed the world's population, 18,000 little children die of starvation on planet Earth every day. That was our fifth topic. The sixth topic was politics, and I'm indebted here to Mary Kate Crawford. Where's Mary Kate? Mary Kate Crawford and Maureen Ryan. Where's Maureen? For leading that session. Thank you. Thanks a million. So we labour under the naive assumption that we elect our representatives who then represent us. And of course, nothing can be further from the truth. We do not have elections in this country. We have selections in this country. We get to choose among a battery of pre-selected candidates, pre-vetted candidates. I gave you this story one time about a period in Irish history in the 1600s, when Ireland was trying to get independence from England, or at least home governance from England. And the suggestion was made that the Irish population would choose 3 candidates whom they will agree to be their kind of the representative, the ruling representative on behalf of England. And England would appoint one of these 3. England came back with a counter-suggestion and says, no, we got a better idea. We'll propose 3 names to you, and then you can pick one of those 3. Now, that seems like it's the same arrangement. It's very, very different. So let's say the Irish population says, we'll propose 3 people and we ask you to choose one of these. We want to be ruled by either the Dalai Lama or Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa. Now you pick one of these 3 and we'll agree to be ruled by this person. England comes back and says, no, we got a better idea. We'll give you Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler and Saddam Hussein. And now you pick one of those 3 and you'll have him rule over you. That's precisely the situation we have here. We have a slate of candidates who have been vetted and selected by whoever, and we get to choose among them. And then we think we've got these free democratic elections in the United States of America. We got a Supreme Court that appointed our president for us in the year 2000. We got a Supreme Court that created Citizens United, which guarantees that corporations decide our leaders for us into the future. We've put in place an electronic voting system where there's no backup and which can be manipulated à longe, from a distance, electronically or radio, so that the results can be just flipped at choice. We have state campaigns to expunge voters from the lists or prevent people from registering to vote. We have lobbyists who decide policy at the federal level. We have an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which does the same thing at a state level. These are people from corporate America who create model legislation for the states in the union, and they're particularly interested in 3 areas: in education, in the prison system, and in union busting. And they've already created 800 pieces of legislation that have been passed in different states of this union. And then to top it all off, we've got a House of Representatives, 435 people, who have to go up for election every 2 years. So they spend their entire tenure, 2 years, trying to create funds to get elected the next time. And of course, that's playing straight into the hand of the lobbyists. The 7th topic we covered was lucid dreaming. And again, this was an effort to try to introduce some light into the equation, to realize that there are tools available to us to try to deal with this kind of darkness. Lucid dreaming, in the normal waking state, we have perception via our sensorium. So when we're awake, we take in information through our sensorium, and then we process it through this black box up here. When we're dreaming, we have perception without the use of our sensorium. And so in our dream state, our entire life, our inner life, is created not through sensory input, there is no sensory input, but through intrapsychic kinds of activity. But when we dream and we're aware of the fact that we're dreaming, this is called lucid dreaming. And lucid dreaming, when we learn to develop this skill, confers extraordinary possibilities on us. Typically in waking state, our culture determines what our belief systems are. You grow up in any culture, you're given a whole set of belief systems. Your belief systems determine what you're allowed to focus on. You won't focus on stuff that you don't believe is real. Your focus then circumscribes what you're prepared to explore. And it determines what your experience is. And your experience tells you then what reality is. So there's this circular argument where you start with the culture that gives you a belief system, that circumscribes your expectations, that limits what you can hope for, and therefore your experience is circumscribed by your belief systems, and your reality is created from your experiences. So this circle continues, and we're stuck in this little box. Now, when you learn to take your dreams seriously, or you learn to dream lucidly, you can break out of that system. You can learn to have expectations outside the scientific box of waking consciousness. You can learn how to fly in your dreams. You can learn in your dream state to break out of all the cultural inhibitions and all the cultural restraints that you're subject to in waking consciousness. And I talked about ways that you can prepare for learning how to lucid dream. Some of them are developing dream signs so that when you have these things happen to you in a dream, you can realize it's a dream. So for instance, if you find yourself flying in a dream or levitating or walking in water, it's a trigger to suggest to yourself, oh my God, I know I can't do this in waking consciousness, so I must be dreaming. And there you're clued in to realizing you're dreaming. And once you begin to realize you're dreaming, you have extraordinary possibilities. What are some of the applications of dreaming lucidly? The first application is that you can learn to dissolve anxiety really, really quickly. By dealing with dream material, you can resolve a whole lot of issues in the dream state that you don't have the opportunity to resolve in waking state. In fact, people who work with their dreams lucidly report that there's almost a 90% reduction in their anxiety levels in waking consciousness because they've resolved so much of this material in lucid dreamings. It allows us to resolve conflicts we're having with real people. As we meet with them in our dreams, we can take on a whole bunch of scenarios, try a whole bunch of approaches, and learn what works. So very often, we can resolve conflicts with real people during the lucid dream. They're extraordinary for creative problem solving. So many great scientific discoveries happened in the dream state. Kekule's benzene ring, he discovered while he was asleep on a bus dreaming. The guy who created the mechanical sewing machine, it came to him in a dream that he needed to put the hole at the other end of the needle. Jack Nicklaus very shamefacedly admitted at one stage he'd been going through a tremendous slump in which to get a 79 was a major break for months and months and months. And he had a dream in which he was shown a new way of holding his club. And the next day he went out and shot a 63. And the interviewer asked him, how come this sudden turnabout? And almost shamefacedly he said, I'm afraid to tell you the reason. And the guy said, try me. He said, I had a dream. And the dream told me I was holding my club incorrectly. And he went on to win, who Jack Nicklaus is. And so it's this extraordinary creative possibility. People who are subject to handicaps, people who are paraplegic, in the dream state, they can walk, they can swim, they can run, they can have intimate relationships with their loved ones, and so they get to experience a whole range of possibilities which are not available to them in the waking state. And finally, unfinished business. It's a way of dealing with the departed. If we have unfinished business with those who are departed, it is possible to meet with these entities in lucid dreaming. It is a much easier place and way to meet the departed than attempting to do it in waking consciousness. And then maybe finally and most importantly, when you learn to dream lucidly, you learn to live lucidly. And when you learn to live lucidly, you learn how to die lucidly. And so there's a whole yoga, a Tibetan dream yoga, preparing you precisely so that by learning to live lucidly, you learn how to die lucidly. That was our 7th topic. The 8th one was education. And here were some of the facts and figures that we adduced. In World War II, when people were joining the army, there was a literacy test. 98% were deemed to be literate when they signed up for World War II. By 1951, the Korean War, that number was down to 81%. Only 81% of those who were conscripted or signed up were deemed to be literate. By Vietnam in 1973, the number was down to 73%. And this is in spite of the fact that in that period of time, outlay or finances for education went up 350%. Now, the literacy rate for Black Jamaica in 2004 was 98.5%. The literacy rate for white Americans the same year was 83%. So what is happening in our education system? 1.25 million kids drop out of school every year in the United States. 30% of American kids don't finish their high school education. So let me give you just a quick rundown on the history of American education. Before the Civil War in this country, in the 1850s, the American population was easily the most independent civilization planet Earth had ever seen. Your average American built his own house, made his own clothes, grew his own food, educated his own kids, and did his own medical healing. Within 150 years' time, we've been turned into the greatest consumer society the world has ever seen. During that, in the 1850s, schooling such as it was less than 2 hours a day, a few months of the year. And then the Civil War changed all that after the Civil War. A few things happened around this period that really scared the daylights out of the ruling classes in America. Firstly was 1848. All over Europe there were demonstrations and revolutions against incumbent governments. All over Europe. That year, 1848, was extraordinary. People rising up and saying, we've had enough of this elitism and this oppression. Old families in the US of A were increasingly upset by this extraordinary, these hordes of Catholics coming from Celtic and Slavic and Latin countries in the 1850s, 1860s. They had the Great Famine in Ireland, 1845, 46, 47. So from Celtic Europe and from Latin countries and from Slavic countries, there was this huge influx of Catholics, and this really, really upset the ruling elite in the United States. And then finally, with the liberation of the African Americans, there was a whole new wave of free people. And so it was determined that education was the problem, and that we needed a school system which would reduce the population into a docile mass again. And so forced education was not an attempt, forced schooling at least, was not an attempt to educate Americans. It was an attempt to domesticate them and to show them what their places were. The first state to do it was Massachusetts in 1850, and it was resisted by 80% of the population with arms. They took up arms against their own government to resist this. And for years and years and years, Massachusetts was the only state that had forced education. Then some of the big financiers got involved, Carnegie and Rockefeller, and they began to see that, unless we got control of the kids, we didn't have control of the population. And so they set out a three-part attack. The first one was to alienate kids from their parents and sacrifice them to a school system. The second one was to alienate parents to corporations, and the third was to alienate the elderly into reservations or homes of various kinds. The ninth topic we picked up on was justice, and this was done by John Hipsley. So we have these beautiful words that have been coined by our government, like the Patriot Act. Nothing could be further from the truth. If there has ever been a piece of legislation which was non-patriotic, in my opinion, this is what it is. Our emails, our phone messages are being tapped at this stage. There is a $2 billion edifice being created right now to house all of this information. They can't even interpret 99.9% of it right now. It's just they're overloaded with it. But they're building storage facilities, and we're not talking about places where you can put books. We're talking about, byte storage pieces. Imagine a complex being created with $2 billion of taxpayers' money in order to spy upon Americans. I'm not joking when I say this. There are lampposts are being created. I'm not joking you. Lampposts are being created that are capable of spying on Americans. So you're hanging up against a lamppost, you're reading your thing, and the lamppost is recording conversations. They're making refrigerators that they will install in your home, which are spying on you. And so more and more, it's impossible to go anywhere where Big Brother doesn't know what you're thinking and what you're saying. And this is not science fiction. This has happened already. It's only a question of the extent of it and how they manage to persuade us that this is actually for our own good. I heard an interview with Robert Kennedy Jr., where his partner in his law office is a very hotshot constitutional lawyer. And this lawyer looked at all the Supreme Court decisions over the last 20 years and came to an extraordinary conclusion. Whenever there's a case involving an individual American and the government, the Supreme Court always, 100% of the time, rules in favor of the government. When there is a case between an individual American and a corporation, the Supreme Court in every case has ruled in favor of the corporation. And this is the frightening piece. Where there's a dispute between the government and a corporation, 100% of the time, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the corporation. So this is our justice system right now. We have a prison system whereby in 1980, there were 500,000 Americans incarcerated. By 2006, that number was 2.5 million. If you take people who are out on parole, there are 7.25 million Americans involved with the penitential system. That's 3.1% of the entire population involved in the incarceration effort. Most of these are there for non-violent crimes. We're ahead of Russia, we're ahead of Rwanda. We are 5% of the world's population, but 24% of all incarcerated human beings are incarcerated in the United States of America. If you live in this country, you are 15 times more likely to be in jail than if you lived in Japan. And if you live in this country, you are 7 times more likely to be in jail than if you lived in China. Moreover, the system is racist. If you're African American, you're much more likely to run foul of this system than if you're Caucasian. And the length of the stay in comparison to other, civilized nations is ridiculously long. The reason is, of course, is that it's an industry, that the prison is now an industry. It's been taken over by private corporations, and therefore you need to swell the numbers. And a very simple way of swelling the numbers is to create more and more laws that force more and more people to break the law. And so you got your industry and you're packing them in. That was our 9th topic. Our 10th topic was the mass media, and Tom Thomas took responsibility for this. The mass media used to be called the fourth estate, and the reason for it is this. In Europe in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, there were 3 estates. There was the royalty, there was the government, and there were the churches. And these were the aristocracy. They were the groups who called the shots. So there was an effort in Europe in the 1800s to create what was called a fourth estate, the media, the mass media, that would represent the little people, the ordinary people, and give them a voice. And that was the whole raison d'être for the newspaper business, to give ordinary people a voice so that there'd be some level of some way of leveling the playing field between the aristocracy and royalty, the government and the churches. We see what's happened in our times, that it's the plaything of the moguls. They tell us what they want us to hear. Instead of information, instead of facts, and instead of discourse, there's just entertainment and propaganda. You're not getting news when you look at, Fox News. You're getting what the moguls have spun. I call it the 4 reductions. That we have reduced all of the possible states of consciousness that we have access to as human beings: dreaming consciousness, sleeping consciousness, waking consciousness, hypnagogic consciousness, meditative consciousness, mystical consciousness. All of these states of consciousness have been reduced down to one that we grandiosely call the waking state. And then from that one state, we take a totally non-representative subsample and we act as if it in fact is representative of the total thing. That's the second reduction. The third reduction is that we then spin this non-representative subsample of a single state of consciousness and we act as if this indeed is the truth. And then the fourth reduction is you don't even need to think about it. You don't even need to ask the questions. We've asked the questions already. We have the answers. Here's what you need to do. Put more dollars into the military-industrial complex or buy more and more of X or Y or Z. We got a situation of digital profiling going on now, where through the surveillance system, and even if you buy stuff on Amazon.com, all your information is sent to people who they got a profile on you. And whether they want to use this for surveillance purposes or just to sell you stuff, they have information very, very often that you're not even aware you're giving. It's amazing to me that you take somebody like Julian Assange, who's now in the Ecuadorian embassy in London because he's trying to escape an American effort to extradite him here for WikiLeaks. Here's a man who's revealed secret information that our government has been using and our military have been using to kill and maim and torture. And he's made these facts available to the public for free. And he's stuck in an embassy in London. You take Mark Zuckerberg, who's using your information and selling it to corporations, and he becomes the man of the year. One of the big magazines, Time magazine or one of these magazines created, Mark Zuckerberg is the man of the year, because he's taking private information that he's gleaning from you through social networks like Facebook and selling it to corporations. So something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Number 11 was medicine. And again, I'm really grateful to Bill Fried for doing this piece. About 8 years ago, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the top medical journal in this country, commissioned a scientist, a doctor herself, to do a survey of all of the medical literature, oncology, pediatrics, or all the different kinds of magazines and journals, to estimate how many Americans die every year from iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis, medically caused illnesses. What they found out was that in the year she surveyed it, 250,000 Americans died from physician-related problems, from medical mistakes. The really scary thing was that of those 250, some of them were wrong diagnosis, wrong surgeries. Some of them, 106,000 of these 250 died after being given the correct doses of the drugs prescribed by the pharmaceutical companies. 106,000 Americans died because they received the correct doses of these medications as prescribed by the pharmaceutical industry. I read a book last year called Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's written by a guy called Whittaker, who for years was a scientist who created the experimental protocols that the pharmaceutical industries used in order to test new medications. Eventually, he became so aware of the damage that these pharmaceuticals are causing that he left the industry and wrote this book. It's called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And I just want to quote 2 statistics from that book for you. In 1987, there were 16,200 American children on SSI because of mental disabilities. That was the year that the great SSRIs became available for the first time ever. These wonder drugs that were going to cure all these mental illnesses. By the year 2007, 20 years down the road, that number had gone from 16,200 to 561,569. There were 561,569 American children on SSI because of mental disability. In fact, by 2008, a government survey established that 1 in 16 of all young American people have serious mental illnesses. While the pharmaceutical company is killing us at this rate, they're also making efforts to outlaw alternative medical models like homeopathy and naturopathy and herbal treatments. They make their best efforts to outlaw all of these. And then there's what's called the file drawer effect, where when these companies do experimental protocols that don't work, they don't publish them. It's called the file drawer effect. You only publish the stuff that appears to work. That was number 11. Are we having fun yet? Number 12 was the military-industrial complex, and Lawrence Byrd did this piece for us. This was a term that was coined very famously by President Eisenhower on one of his last days in office, January 17th, 1961, just before he handed over to Kennedy, and he warned about the military-industrial complex. Now, it used to be that American troops and the American military was there to protect us and to keep the world safe, not just for Americans, but for democracy. More and more, our military are being used to soften up areas in the world for corporate, colonialism for our interests. We borrow $2 billion a day as a country. That's $730 billion a year we borrow. We spend $1 trillion a year on the military-industrial complex. So we spend everything we borrow and another $250,000 every year on the military-industrial complex. Are we safer as a result of that? That's not accounting for money that goes into what's called the black ops. This notion of a trickle-down technology and a trickle-down economy where if you give the money to the guys up at the top, it'll trickle down to the rest of us. And if you put a lot of our geniuses, creating military technology, eventually it'll trickle down to the rest of us in GPS and whatever. I'm sick to my back teeth of trickle-down economics and trickle-down technology. Why aren't we employing our best brains to create technologies for education or for health or for agriculture in our life instead of spending it killing other people's kids? And the last topic we covered was extraterrestrials, ancient and modern. So some of the ancient evidence that I adduced during that talk were the age of the universe versus the age of planet Earth. The universe is calculated or reckoned to be 13.7 billion years of age. Planet Earth is calculated to be 4.6. So literally, there are parts of the universe that are 3 times older than us. It is ridiculous to believe that life evolved nowhere else except here and that we're as intelligent as it gets. Francis Drake, a radio astronomer in the 1950s and a co-founder with Carl Sagan of SETI, created a formula in the 1950s, which was an estimate of the number of civilizations just in the Milky Way galaxy alone that had developed technologies capable of communicating outside their own solar system. And it's a multifactorial equation. And there are various ways of slotting values in for these factors. But a very conservative estimate by Francis Drake himself estimated there were 10,000 such civilizations. Carl Sagan disagreed with him, and when he slotted his numbers in, it was more like 1 million. As we begin to discover more and more exoplanets, that number is much more likely to be in the billions, that there are billions of civilizations in our universe which have developed technologies capable of communicating outside their own solar systems. When you look at even life on planet Earth itself, 4.6 billion years ago, the planet itself kind of congealed or congregated. By 3.7 billion years ago, life was beginning to grow. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA, reckoned that this process happened through what he called directed panspermia. That spores of life came onto planet Earth in specially designed craft, I'm using his words precisely, specially designed craft that were sent to planet Earth to seed life on the planet itself. So life was seeded. As far as I'm concerned, planet Earth is a Garden of Eden that was seeded, fertilized, weeded on a regular basis and tended by some kinds of civilizations who occasionally genetically modified it in order to create these quantum leaps in our evolutionary trajectory. The genetic experience itself tells us that our mitochondria is only 200,000 years old. What happened before that? It can only be traced back 200,000 years. So something extraordinary happened around 200,000 years ago to account for the fact that we've got mitochondrial DNA in our system. We've discovered, when you look at the Genome Project, that the human genome has been cut and spliced. There's a way of cutting a DNA sequence biochemically, not with a scissor, but biochemically, and you can reinsert it into different parts of the sequence or invert it. And when you do that, you either get a breakthrough or you get a breakdown. Somebody has been experimenting with the human DNA. There are over 4,000 mistakes in human DNA. The average animal has something in the region of maybe 200 mistakes, genetic mistakes. There are over 4,000 mistakes in the human DNA. Somebody has been messing around with the sequencing. And as I mentioned before, we have 46 chromosomes as distinct from all of the other primates from whom we're allegedly descended, who have 48 each. The great wisdom traditions all over the world, over 200 different cultures, have spoken about extraterrestrial civilizations, or what they call gods, who came down and created us and modified us, who created a deluge because they got upset with us. The Sumerians talk about it at great length. They talk about the Anunnaki. Hinduism talks about it. Hinduism divides life and the universe into 4 groups. Earthlings, Asuras, who are extraterrestrials that have got a very a violent agenda. Devas, who are extraterrestrials who are much more advanced and have a spiritual agenda, and then celestials, who are avatars who occasionally incarnate on planet Earth. The Bible itself, if you call yourself a Christian in any manner of means, then you have to submit and subscribe to extraterrestrial belief systems. God obviously is not a terrestrial, so God is obviously an extraterrestrial. God is from outside this planet, and everything that happens is an input from extraterrestrial sources. If we were created by God, and this God is not an earthling, then some extraterrestrial, whom we call God, is responsible for fashioning us. At some stage, allegedly, and there's not just one, when you read the Bible, the word that's used is Elohim. Elohim in Hebrew is a plural. And so you get it even in translation. God says, let us make man in our own image and likeness. With whom is God having this conversation? God is not this transcendent unity that we think of now. This was some kind of extraterrestrial being who was going to interfere in planet Earth and create some kind of a being in their own image, and there was a dialogue going on. And after they had created it, we're told in Genesis chapter 6 that the sons of God, whoever they are, found the daughters of men very attractive, and they took them to wife, as many as they wanted, and they created a race called, the Bible gives them 2 different names, the Nephilim or the Anakim, a race of giants. Who are these sons of God that found the daughters of men really attractive and mated with them and created a subspecies? Obviously some kinds of extraterrestrials who, having fashioned a genetically modified, Homo erectus, is now wanting to breed with them. We have lots of situations in the Bible where individuals are some kind of half-breed between God and man. And I'm saying this with no disrespect whatsoever. Jesus is obviously a hybrid. If we are to be a true Christian, you have to believe that Jesus had only one human parent and the other was an extraterrestrial. It wasn't a terrestrial, definitely. Well, whatever you call the Father or you call the Holy Spirit, it's not a terrestrial being. So Jesus himself is a hybrid between an extraterrestrial and a terrestrial. And you find this all over ancient literature, these hybrids between the gods and human beings. You have abduction scenarios, where Enoch and Elijah are both taken up in heaven. You got spacecraft like Ezekiel's flying chariot. You get Jacob's ladder, where he's lying in the ground and some kind of a craft lands and a ladder comes down and there are angels ascending and descending. So the ancient evidence is copious in the belief systems that we interfaced with extraterrestrials who are largely involved in our creation or modifying who we are. And the modern evidence, and these are tens of thousands of incidents. I'm going to pick out a few from the civilian literature and a few from the military literature. Civilian encounters. Japanese airline, a 747, in January 1987, flying from Alaska to Japan, is accompanied by 2 huge big spacecraft that accompany it for over half an hour. There's radar contact with military radar on the ground, with civilian radar on the ground, with the radar on board, and with the pilots watching it. When the guy is debriefed, and when he reaches Japan, he's totally convinced that he described them as bigger than battleships with extraordinary maneuverability. When the American, agency responsible for investigating this, the head of that organization was a guy called John Callahan. And when he saw the evidence, he was totally convinced of it. But the evidence was quashed. And he made a final, very interesting statement. He said, who are you going to believe? Your own lying eyes or the government? In Belgium in the 1990s, there was a wave that went on for several months of huge delta-shaped craft overflowing Belgium night after night after night after night. It was investigated by the Belgian Air Force, and a general called De Broer is on record talking about these were silent, they were huge, they had extraordinary maneuverability, they stopped in midair and just hovered, they lit up whole areas with some kinds of lamps from above. They were totally non-hostile, and for months they tried to follow them with fighter jets and to know that these things would just outrun them at will. In 1997, the 13th of March, there's the famous what's called the Phoenix Lights incident, where a similar craft, huge big delta-shaped craft, flying really, really slowly over the city of Phoenix, seen by hundreds of people, including the governor of the state himself, Fife Symington, who originally made fun of it and then admitted finally and came out and made an appeal to the government to explain to them what's happening here. Are these our own aircraft, or are these of extraterrestrial origin? And finally, in 2006, at O'Hare Airport, over the United Terminal in O'Hare Airport, in 2006, they spotted an aircraft, a disc, hovering just below cloud level over gate number 17. And it stayed for 5 minutes and was seen by a whole bunch of ground crew and pilots. And then after 5 minutes, it shot off through the cloud cover, and it literally made a hole, like a cookie cutter hole in the cloud, so you could see right through and see blue sky at the other side. Military encounters, I'm just going to pick two of them. 1976, Iran. Two F-16s were scrambled to follow a UFO, and they chased it all the ways to the Russian border. They attempted to deploy Sidewinder missiles to knock it down, and their entire systems jammed. Every time they got radar lock on it and attempted to deploy their missile systems just jammed up. And in 1980, a Peruvian Air Force, a huge big UFO appeared over a military air base, and they scrambled jets to interact with it, and no matter what they fired at it, it had no effect whatsoever. So there's something up there, guys. Now we get to the fun part. Section C, assembling the jigsaw puzzle. So the first point, are there connections among these topics? All these topics we've covered as you've interacted with the data. Do you think that the corruption that exists in all these different areas, whether it's agriculture, education, or justice, or finances, or politics, or whatever, is this all just coincidence? No. Yeah? Is it just individual people who are greedy or violent or whatever, just doing their thing? When I examine the evidence, and I've been delving into this material for many, many years, I create a kind of an equation for myself. So it's a multifactorial equation, and here's the elements of it for me. Some of it is due to individual people's greed, definitely. Individuals who are greedy, can create a lot of problems. Some of it is due to individual corporations. You take an individual corporation with a corrupt CEO or middle management or whatever, and they can do a lot of crap. That's part of it. Definitely, there is some kind of what's being called the corporatocracy. A corporatocracy with a kind of a meta-greed, where the notion of the corporation as such has been guilty of such greed and such violence that it takes it to a whole new level. I think what have been called the banksters are the people who are money laundering on behalf of these greedy, violent people. Congress, in my opinion, the more I read of it, are literally just pawns in this game. They have almost no power in this game. They're the people who appear to be in charge, and they're the people who appear to be important. They're neither our leaders nor are they powerful in this whole operation, as far as I can make out. Presidents are nothing more than puppets or figureheads. They do what they're told, when they're told, and how they're told. The judiciary are the hatchet men who create the kinds of legislation or interpret the Constitution or dismantle the Constitution according to the needs of those who are really calling the shots. And somewhere in that, there are some kind of cabals who are really calling the shots. So you put all these pieces together in some kind of an equation, and you weight the factors differently because some of them are much more important than others, and you get a true picture, of how the system really is operating. That's my first point. The second one, I said, conspiracy is a four-letter word. As I've watched the political discourse in this country over the last 20 years, what amazes me is the extraordinary manipulation of the lexicon. The ways in which words are meant to mean not just what they don't mean, but the very opposite of what they actually mean. So you get words that have come into the lexicon like collateral damage. Collateral damage means people got murdered or killed, but we call it collateral damage. Or friendly fire. Friendly fire is when we kill our own troops because of a screw up, but it's called friendly fire. Now, when you're dead, it doesn't matter to them whether the bullet came from an enemy or a friend, you're still as dead. The notion of the Patriot Act, I can't think of anything as nauseous as the notion that this is actually something that's enshrining and inspiring patriotism in Americans. Our Citizens United. As citizens are united to give corporations the right to be human beings. I love this bumper sticker that said in the 99%, I'll believe that a corporation is a person the first time one of them is executed in Texas. Corporations are not people, but we act as if they are. We call it Citizens United. How many citizens united to create that piece of legislation? Or the notion I mentioned earlier of the fiscal cliff. We create this lexicon in which we turn words on their heads. And then we take words, so having sanctified, evil, we now demonize good. So if you're called a liberal in this country, you got to hang your head in shame. If you're a liberal, you're a really, really, really bad person. If you're somebody who's out for liberty and equality, you're a commie. There's something wrong if you're a liberal. And the worst word of all is conspiracy. Conspiracy is a four-letter word. Now, I want to examine conspiracy for a little bit. I'm going to define conspiracy as follows. If two or more people plan to undertake something which has significant repercussions for other people who are neither consulted nor even informed, that's a conspiracy. If two or more people plan to create a course of action which has significant impact on the lives of other people who are neither consulted nor even informed, that is a conspiracy. And there are conspiracies all the ways up the system, from just locally. If we decide, for instance, to build an incinerator in the Bay Area, what are the chances, you can vote now, what are the chances it's going to happen, it's going to be built in Portola Valley, or it's going to be built in East Palo Alto? Who's going to be belching out, drinking in the smoke? Is it going to be Portola Valley people or East Palo Altans?
East Palo.
China. Okay, China, great. So we'll export it, but that's a conspiracy. People are determining that they don't want bad health, they want somebody else to have it instead. The CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the DIA, the KGB, MI5, all of these intelligence organizations throughout the world who are getting billions of dollars from their government, allegedly to protect us, but in fact to tell lies, to torture, to topple regimes. Are you going to tell me that that's not a conspiracy? Have you been involved? Have you been consulted about how you want your tax dollars spent? Is this how you want it spent? Everything that we've studied, in my opinion, has an imprint of some kind of conspiratorial activity in it. ALEC, I talked about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that creates legislation, model legislation, which gets enacted around prison, education, union busting. How many of you got consulted by ALEC before they created that legislation? Isn't that a conspiracy? It involved you. It involved your life. The lobbyists that go to our parliamentarians and our Congress on a daily basis to push through their agenda. How many times have you been consulted by any of these people? How often have they asked you your opinion before they went to members of Congress and decided what they wanted to tell members of Congress? Our Constitution is being shredded year by year by year. Have any of you been consulted by anybody and asked you, is this okay for us to do this? Are you in favour of it? Has the Supreme Court even ruled on it? The dismantling of our Constitution. Isn't that a conspiracy? When Monsanto's revolving door, when the Monsanto CEO resigns from his position, takes up a position in the Ministry of Agriculture, creates legislation that favours Monsanto, then resigns and goes back to Monsanto, how often have these people consulted you or asked your permission for that? Isn't this conspiracy? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate? There are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. How many of those get consulted by the Pope before he issues a new decree on women priests or artificial contraception? Any of you guys ever get consulted by the Pope?
One half a person.
Yeah, one half a person. On a scale of 1 to 10, of the 7 billion people on planet Earth, how many of those people do you think got consulted before geo-engineering happened, before we started spraying the clouds, or before countries go to war, or before some huge international financial agreement is made? How many people get consulted? Isn't all this conspiracy?
Why would they consult us? It's not our country.
It's not your country. So for people to make conspiracy a bad word and pretend like it doesn't happen and only crooks, are talking about it, we got our head in the sand. We live in a mesh of conspiracies. It's hard to know what the truth is, to find our way out of it. Section 3, the history of conspiracy to oppress. This is not just something that the America invented in the last 30 or 40 years. Since the very, very beginning, it's been our tendency. So there's been some form of conspiracy to oppress elements of society from the very, very beginning of Homo sapiens. If you believe the scriptures themselves, or you believe the Sumerian stories, this has been part of the human trajectory from the very, very beginning. People conspiring to oppress other elements of society. The cycle probably happened many, many times on planet Earth, and it probably happened elsewhere in the evolution of civilization until they got beyond it. Certainly the gods did it to us. If you read the scriptural tradition, there was conspiracy among the gods to create us, to punish us when it didn't work out, to throw us out of the garden. St. Augustine says very famously that the result of original sin, whatever the original sin was, that really upset these gods, the result of it was that our will was weakened, our intellect was darkened, and our bodies were subjected to sickness and to death. Isn't that a conspiracy by people who had the power, to give us clarity, intelligence, health, longevity, but take all those things away from us? How else would you categorize that? Even hunter-gatherer societies, you go back 10, 15,000 years, matriarchal hunter-gatherer societies practiced slavery. So even in the matriarchal systems, there was parts of the population who were enslaved. That is a conspiracy, when one group determines what the fate of the other must be. But after the agricultural revolution, which was about 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago, things really, really took off. So around that time, you had the invention of the ox-drawn plough, you had the domestication of horses, you had glazed pottery that allowed us to store food, and you had the invention of the wheel. And now for the first time ever, it became really possible to oppress huge segments of society. Now human beings were commodities, and food was a weapon of war. Now you could burn a person's granaries and deprive them of food for the next year. Now booty became a reality. Before the invention of the wheel and the domestication of the horses, if you attacked a village, you could only go away with what you could carry on your shoulder. Now, with the wheel and horses, you could carry away as much booty as you wanted. Now war really made sense. Now the empires get erected. Now you create a whole pyramid of power. You have an aristocracy, you have a warrior caste, you have a priesthood, and then you got the ordinary people, and then you got women, and at the end of the pile, you got the slaves. And religion now gets hijacked. The mystical impulse gets hijacked to create mythologies and stories and ritual that will enhance the position of the status quo. And then to kind of finance all this, you need taxes. And so you create a taxation system on the little people. So the people who have all the power and all the resources actually aren't producing anything. They're not producing food, they're not producing implements, agricultural implements, they're producing nothing except taxation and war, but they're taking everything from the little guys. This mentality seeps in all over the world. Wherever you get a colonialist regime, when Britain overran the island of Tasmania, they regarded the Tasmanians as not human. So they there was a genocide. They were all wiped out. To a single human being, they were all wiped out. And the last 2 Tasmanians, a man and a woman, were killed, and I'm not joking you, they were killed, they were sent to a taxidermist. They were stuffed, and they were sent back to the British Museum as exhibits for these creatures who are not human. Only about 10 years ago were those 2 bodies returned to Tasmania and buried. So for over 100 years, these 2 stuffed human beings are in glass cages in the British Museum as evidence of lesser life forms. There's an infamous expedition of German hunters in South Africa in the 1880s who kept a log of their kills. And one log has the following information. It says, mammals killed on our hunt. And then it listed 300 or 400 lions, 200 elephants, and 300 bushmen, mammals who were killed on this hunting safari. So this notion of oppression and this notion of a caste system is as old as planet Earth itself. We're not dealing with anything new, just a different form of it. The whole notion of eugenics found tremendous favour with Charles Darwin. In fact, his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, a great mathematician of his time, was responsible for the term eugenics. Darwin himself subscribed to it. So in Darwin's second book, which is called The Descent of Man, he warns British people, and I'm not joking you, he warned British people against breeding with the Irish because there would be regression to the mean. The whole humans would descend back into their savage origins if we mixed pure-blood English people with the mere Irish. So Darwin was a total racist. So you have this, eugenics has been part of the equation for a long period of time. Since the agricultural revolution, 3000 BC, and the industrial revolution in the 1700s, things have gotten worse and worse, and better, faster and faster. So the whole evolutionary thing is taking off. The second last point I'll make is this. Are there organizations or any kinds of cabals, who are involved in this process at whatever level? Yes, I believe there are. So very, very often, these people have no interest in public, exposure. They're interested in private power, but they're not interested in public exposure. So the people you think are leading the kind of the phrase like the Congress people or whatever, the ones who are out in front, they're the guys who love, the focus, but they have no power whatsoever. The people who love the power are in the background. They're not seen. And at every level of this organization, there's a different lie told. There's an appropriate lie told for every level of this. So if we want to go to war, for instance, the lie that's told to the little African-American kid in a village in Georgia is that we got to go out and beat kick the ass off these commies or these terrorists. And so these kids sign up because for them it's about holding back the forces of communism or terrorism. That's the lie they need to hear in order to get involved. What is the lie that the level of generals get to hear? The level they get to hear is that, we need to protect American interests. We need to make sure that, the world is the plaything of American economic interests. And that's the lie that they're told. That's what they go after. The guys further up the chain, the real guys at the top, they have no interest in America whatsoever. They have no interest in patriotism. These were guys in former incarnation that lived in Mesopotamia. And subsequently they lived in Egypt when Egypt was a power. And then they lived in Greece when Greece was a power. And then they lived in Rome when Rome was the power. And then it was Spain and Portugal when they were the powers. And then it was Britain when Britain was the power. And it's now come to the United States. And at some stage it'll keep going west. It's always been going west. It'll land in China and they'll reincarnate there. There are people, who want to create a caste system with a small group at top who call the shots and then the slave class at the bottom. So you're not going to see those people a lot in public. You'll see the smaller people. So what are some of these organizations? Do they exist? Yes, they exist. I'm going to just mention 4 of them. I don't know how high up they go. I believe that there are ones are way, way above this, but I'll mention those that I've read about and have studied about. The Bohemian Club was started in 1872 in San Francisco, and it was originally a gentleman's club for artists. And in fact, the Constitution still makes it imperative that there be at least 10% of the membership are artists. But meantime, it's become a private club for gentlemen. And typically, it's CEOs, businessmen, politicians, and presidents-to-be. So, for instance, Nixon and Reagan both appeared, as members of this en route to becoming presidents of the United States of America. They have an annual 2-week get-together at the Bohemian Grove. There's a big 40-foot statue of an owl that's burned on the last day of in this ritual, and all kinds of vow-taking and backslapping, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Guys looking out for each other. That was founded in 1872. The second one is the Council of Foreign Relations, founded in 1921. And it's the nation's most important foreign policy think tank. And surprise, surprise, the think tank is called the David Rockefeller Think Tank. That's a name you're going to see in a lot of different places. The Bilderberg Group was founded in 1954, and it's an annual meeting of bankers, politicians, and corporate chiefs by invitation only, and there's somewhere between 120 and 140 invitees invited every year. But there are no invitees from any of the developing nations, because they don't want, by their own phrase, another United Nations. This is for the guys who hold the power and want to keep the power. And the fourth group is called the Trilateral Commission, founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller. And it's a trilateral commission of the United States of America, the European Union, and Japan. And in their founding charter, it says the following, I'm quoting directly. The young are not being sufficiently indoctrinated by school, college, and churches. Part of their concern. This is exactly a quotation from their charter. They're really concerned that the youth of the United States, Europe, and Japan are not being sufficiently indoctrinated by the school system, the college system, and the churches. Sorry, we're not doing our job. The final piece I want to mention, second last piece. Trans-humanism. I don't know if you've come across this phrase ever, trans-humanism. I only came across it a few months ago in my research. Trans-humanism is the belief system and the working towards a stage of human evolution beyond where we are at now. And there are various types of it. Now, it's inevitable to think that evolution, which started on planet Earth as a rock, and then went to biological life forms, and then rational beings, to think that evolution has stopped now is really ridiculous. Why would it stop? So why would we think that with the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens, that evolution has stopped on planet Earth? It obviously hasn't stopped. It continues apace. And one line of it is through the human being. So where is this line that's leading through human beings headed? And that's what the phrase trans-humanism means. Now, the difference is that evolution up to now has been the evolution of consciousness. There seemed to have been an inner drive. You can call it spirit, you can call it God, you can call it source. There's been an inner energy driving the whole system forward inexorably. But with the advent of thinking beings, for the first time ever, we get the opportunity to participate in this process, to accelerate it, or to send it off in a diversionary tactic. And that's the big difference between the evolution of consciousness and conscious evolution. Now, with conscious evolution, there are different visions possible of what's going to happen here. And I'm going to just mention two of them. And I talked about this many, many times in the past. One version of transhumanism is Homo sociopathicus, which is violent, greedy, warmongering, that leads off to the destruction of the planet and the denizens of the planet. And the other line is Homo spiritualis, people who are transcending mere physical identification and realizing that they're eternal beings and that everything on the planet is a word of God made flesh. So there are different visions of this transhumanistic agenda. There are also different ways to get there. And so, for instance, there is a way of getting there by transcending identification with physicality, or there's a way of getting there through technologies of various kinds, and I'll mention a few of these. So DARPA, which is the Defense Agency's research branch, has put millions and millions of dollars into trying to create super soldiers, investigating not only the physiology and the kind of the resilience of human beings, but also the psychological abilities of human beings and the ability to manipulate them. There was a movie called The Manchurian Candidate. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is not science fiction. It is really possible that you can mentally control the activities of individual beings so they perform actions and then have no memories whatsoever that they've performed these actions. These are the ultimate assassins. I trained Bill to be an assassin. He goes to France. He assassinates the president of France. But I've indoctrinated him in such a way that in the debriefing, he has no memory of ever. He knew he went to France. He thought he went to the Riviera. He had a great time, a great holiday, and he's got the suntan to prove it. And he has no memory whatsoever of the assassination he just carried out. These are the super soldiers that are where research is trying to provide right now. We're doing it with GMOs, genetically modified organisms. When you begin to ingest organisms that have themselves been genetically modified, you're becoming genetically modified, for good or for ill, depending on what the agenda is. This chemtrail spraying is definitely affecting the quality of human health. A friend of mine in the Palo Alto Clinic told me this year that they're seeing 10 times more upper respiratory illness in the Palo Alto Clinic than they've ever seen before. Is that a coincidence, or the fact that they've been spraying these chemicals now for 3 or 4 years in the Bay Area? The pharmaceutical industry, as it's creating more and more pills to solve more and more problems, are creating more and more side effects. Is this coincidence or just collateral damage, or is there some kind of an agenda behind this? Nanotechnology and biotechnology very definitely give us the possibility of engineering the human physiology and maybe human psychology for whatever purpose we choose to use it, for good or for ill. And certainly gene splicing, messing with the gene itself, is possible to create a master race and a serf class if we choose to do that. The very notion of surveillance, where it is impossible anymore to do anything secretly, has 2 possible outcomes, in my opinion. It is going to create a mongrel slave race, or is going to create a group of people who see that there is no purpose in dissembling, or no purpose in lying, or no purpose in secrecy, so they become aligned totally with God and totally with Source, and they transcend the mere human tendency to tell lies or to exaggerate. You're going to see 1 or 2 outcomes from that. And the final section is, what about us? What is our response to this? The first response obviously is, and obviously the last session we do, and next one with God's help, will be an effort to look much more at the solutions and the responses to this. But just off the top of my head right now, we cannot solve any problem from the same mindset that created it. So while it is incumbent upon us to confront the corrupt leaders and dysfunctional systems, that is not enough. We need to remember our mission. We need to remember why we came here. We need to remember our preconception contract, that we agreed to come onto planet Earth at this stage, at this extraordinarily critical stage in human history, when there's a bifurcation point ahead of us between Homo sapien, between Homo sociopathicus and Homo spiritualis. We need to transcend and not just be stuck, although we have the responsibility to disempower corrupt leaders and disempower dysfunctional systems. Evolution has always gone in quantum leaps. Evolution is not a gradual process. It's always a question of quantum leaps. We went from a rock to life, to rational life, to soul-filled life, and the next one is going to be a quantum leap as well. We can't just get there using baby steps. We have to think and behave totally differently. This, in my opinion, is the real reason that Source gave us avatars and it gave us Buddhas. We're in a game, the most important game that planet Earth has ever played. And the team that is chosen to represent planet Earth at this stage is all of us. There's not a single person on planet Earth here right now, I believe, that didn't come down here with full cognizance of the situation into which it was coming and was signing up to be a force for good. But 99.9% of us are asleep at the wheel. If we don't wake up really, really, really quickly, there won't be a world for our kids to inhabit. Personally, I'm really, really confident. I really believe that we have the numbers and we have the enlightenment necessary to inspire each other so that we make the kinds of changes and we think the kind of thoughts and we create the kinds of governance that allows us to make this transition from just being Homo sapiens to becoming Homo spiritualis. I'm sorry I went on so long, guys. It's 10 to 9. Bob.
Well, I hope there aren't anybody who has started out this evening in a depressed state. Because you could be awful more depressed listening to you, except for your last couple of minutes. 90%, 9% was way down here. And I think there's a place for a skeptic in this world as a range, put a more graduated spread in this range. There are good skeptics and bad skeptics, and good skeptics are helping those who are critical thinkers by saying we do not accept things at face value because there are a certain amount of evidence, because we can often find opposite evidence, and we must be very careful. We're challenging statements that are made by anyone, including some of the things you said tonight. I could think of many counter examples in many of the areas. I don't want to go through that, take a long time, and so I'm not nearly as depressed as you are.
I'm not depressed at all, Bob.
But your conversation tonight could make other people depressed,
Okay.
I'll tell you that.
Okay, sorry.
Reality hurts.
Reality,
Yeah.
if you believe that's all
Reality is
reality.
painful.
I don't believe that's all reality, though. I think there's another side of reality. If I was giving this talk and said, and this is what, and I agree with 90% of what he said, but however, there are people in the press, for example, I read a lot of writers, for example, that support we're growing, we're getting better all the time, we can do better than this, and so on. There are people out there writing. The press media is not completely negative. You don't know them, I'll give you a name of some of them. See me afterwards, but anyway, there are people who do that. And
Yeah, but nobody reads them.
I read them.
Okay, you're one.
And maybe some of the other people read them too. I bet I could say, I can name 2 more people who read them here. Why do you read them? Maybe you find that you don't have to disagree with them all the time
I
then.
read several,
Okay.
rags that aren't in the,
Okay, so therefore don't read everything with the same bad brush. When you do that, I think it weakens the argument a little bit. We have to make the arguments right. I think you're right, 90%. I can say at 10%, I'm still skeptical. But anyway, that's my general
Okay,
impression
great.
of the evening. I'd
Great,
like
Bob.
to
Fellas.
finish there without
Fellas.
going further.
Mike?
I certainly agree with your last statements. I thought those are really good. I do want to say, though, all of these topics are extremely complex and very controversial. As I look down the list, I would consider myself knowledgeable probably in politics. And politics is obviously very complicated. There are many ways of looking at it. I felt one side was presented, and I could go on and on. At the end, when you sort of pull it together, I think there are a lot of different explanations about history and how we evolved and how it works and so forth. I personally landed on 2 people that meant a lot to me, and that was Teilhard de Chardin and Karl Marx. And Marx has great explanations for this, and it's basically built upon the idea that there are people who do the productive labor, by that, the things that are necessary, and those who live off of them. I don't see this as a conspiracy. I see it as a pursuit of self-interest. And I think our politics can best be understood not in terms of conspiracy, but in terms of self-interest. And certain powers, certain groups have much more power to pursue their interests than others, obviously corporations. But I don't see this as the John Birch people used to see everything in terms of the communist conspiracy. I don't see it as that at all. I think it's much more complex. The last thing I want to say is that each one of these topics is extremely controversial. Extremely controversial. I could raise counter-arguments for every point that's been made, and I could raise supporting arguments for every point that's been made. And I don't think that they should be presented as facts and as this is true. I think they should be presented as ideas to think about. But none of these major topics is there a solid foundation to say this is it.
Okay, Mike. So let me just make one response to Bob. And I agree totally. The object of this entire exploration group is to get people thinking and coming to their own decisions. So you will examine the data and you'll come to your conclusions. I examine the data, I come to my conclusions. But certainly as far as the skeptics are concerned, the views I've proposed and my readings on these subjects are controversial only because they're not the norm. And therefore, what we're being exposed to is a totally different version of the truth and a totally different interpretation of the facts. And so I'm trying to do some little thing to try to level the playing field. I'm not going out there proposing an interpretation, which is disregarding all of the others. I'm saying I'm definitely in the minority, and my viewpoint and the data I'm assembling is being ignored by 99% of the news media out there. And if it weren't for, crazy people like me elsewhere, this stuff would not be getting out. There wouldn't even be a discussion as to whether or not there are different possible interpretations of the data. Yeah.
It's better to present it. This is an opinion. This is the evidence that I have to support it. The counter evidence is also there.
I said that at the very, very beginning introduction. I said the scientific method. Okay. The scientific system is the creation of hypotheses, testing it, models, anomalous data, tweaking the models, and that science never delivers truth. It develops interpretations of the truth and theories about it, which are always subject to verification, or disidentification. Okay, I prefaced my remarks to that. Okay. Ingrid.
Well, that was a pretty heavy download.
Good. Good.
And I'm glad I had a glass of wine before I got here.
Take another one.
Might need another one
home.
afterwards. But as you were going about that, I kept saying, well, where is the love? Mm-hmm. And sometimes I do believe that we are in, this is a hell. Planet Earth can be considered a hell, and it's also heaven. And it's so many times a state of mind and perspective, and your sense of control, and your sense of compassion, and your own self-awareness of who and what you really are. I do believe we're here at a very unique time of human history, and we all have a role to play. But we have to just let our courage and our convictions and what brings us joy, really, life and love will lead the way. That's all I know.
Great, Lorraine. Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks, man. Mary Kate?
I just have two examples of what you're talking about. Barbara Max Hubbard also says it's going to be a leap when we move up.
Okay.
And the other is Aaron Swartz, who just committed suicide.
Yes.
And he did because he was facing 35 years, possible after a court by the Justice Department, and he didn't want to break his parents' money to do that because he was downloading things from MIT, a J file, which was okayed by the J file, okayed by MIT, but the Justice Department was still after him for downloading what was considered secrets. 26 years old.
Right.
I have a question
Sure,
about, I deal with this thing, this duality every day of my life. I need to know, I'm driven to know all these things, and none of this is terribly surprising to me, but it's easy to allow it to lower one's vibration, and that's not what we want to do. I don't want to be a fluff buff, the joy kid, which has her head in the sand either. So we're constantly having to deal with this thing of wanting to be informed. Just compared, this only started my opening up when I was in my early 40s. I grew up a very simple life before that. And in our little tiny little piece of life, we could just ignore all of this stuff happening on, but it's getting a little tough to ignore it anymore because it's impacting everybody. And it's particularly shocking about the educational system. I did learn a lot of, very sad things about it. but there are, light still permeates and squeaks through, and we just have to be bearers of that light, and keep our vibration up at the same time as we really are powerful people, and we have to just come into that power and recognize, and it doesn't, we've got to be powerful people to be even here at this time. There's so much being asked of us, but it is overwhelming in a way, and the law of attraction is such that what we focus on becomes our reality. So if I focus on the world's poop every day, I'm going to see more and more of it. And unless it's something that I personally am going to work with to change, we all have our specialties, then I feel it's better if I focus on what I can do that's good, and being in a state of joy and centeredness and love and connection with Source.
Okay, so let me make two responses. We're over time at this stage, guys. At the very, very beginning, I suggested two different kind of metaphors. If I go to the car mechanic, and I'm a real positive person, and I bring my car in, and he says, yeah, what's the problem? I say, no problem. And he says, what do you bring your car here for? I just had to bring my car here. What do you want me to do with it? I don't know. I'm not going to let my mic go to the problems. I'm not going to talk about problems. He says, well, what am I going to do? I say, well, actually, there's an oil leak, and the brakes failed, and the light system went out. I said, okay, I know I can do something about that. So there's a place in which it's important to be positive, but there's no point in being positive to the extent that I'm not admitting that I got a problem. I go to the doctor, and he says, okay, what can I do for you? And I said, I'm great, I feel really, really good. And he says, why are you coming here? Well, I just thought I'd make a visit. I'm a real busy guy, are you sick? Well, I'm coughing all night long, and I can't, I'm unable to poop for the last 3 days, and so I say, we can do something about that. So there's a point at which we have to, figure out what the symptoms are, make a diagnosis, and then create a treatment plan. But you can't create a treatment plan unless you know what you're dealing with, and the symptoms are the clues. And I specifically set this exercise up 1.5 years ago so that we would look at the symptomology of our world, make a diagnosis, and then create a treatment plan. And so my hope is that we have one more session next month, on the 3rd, I'm going to make it the 3rd Thursday of next month with God's help, to try to brainstorm as a community. What are all of the resources out there? What can we do as individuals and as communities, as a culture, as a nation, as a species? What can we do in order to, create this leap into consciousness? But it would be really foolhardy to have attempted that exercise until we knew what we were dealing with. And so we had to go through the stage of when you find you're going to be disturbed. It's been really, really, really disturbing. The next stage is marveling, because the marveling is the realization that if things weren't as bad as they were, enough of us wouldn't be waking up and becoming enlightened and really see what God's plan is. And God's plan is a shift into Christ consciousness. The marveling cannot happen until we're so mired with the disturbance that even the dumbest of us wake up and begin to do something about it. So my hope is that the final session will be a coming together where we all bring our resources and we say, there's this, podcast out there, or there's this journal out there, whatever it is that you're reading, Bob. There's these possibilities. There's Barbara Marx Hubbard's group. There's meditation classes. There's political activism. Whatever it is, that we assemble all the resources available to us, and then that from here on in, we're light-filled beings who remember that we're here to create the shift in Christ consciousness. But we cannot do that until we've gone through the darkness. When Christ died, we are told in the scriptures, he went down to hell. It's not that he went down where people were excluded from God from all eternity. He had to plumb the depths of the human misery and pain in order to become a resurrection figure to us. And as individuals, there are only wounded healers. If you're not a wounded healer, you're merely a technician. Unless you've been wounded yourself in life, you don't have the compassion necessary to reach out healingly to other people. And that's true not just as an individual basis, it's true as in a community, it's true in a culture, and it's true as a species. I'm hoping that we have immersed ourselves so deeply in the last year in the pain of the human experiment that like Christ we can rise to a whole new vision and dedicate the rest of our lives to ascension, the ascension of the human species into Christ consciousness.